Hello, welcome back to another episode. Now, Chris, I was thinking this week, and I'm not gonna do the polite thing and be like, "Hey, do you listen to any podcasts?" Because I know that you probably don't. So I'm just going to assume that you don't. And I don't particularly listen to a lot of podcasts either. But I was listening to one, and I realized it's a normal thing for podcasts to do like introductions and have like a song and do like this small talk and talk about people's week. And I realized, man, that is not at all how we do our podcast. So if you're like used to normal podcasts and you're expecting like a bit of a, here's what we've been doing in our lives and everything, then I understand this is probably not the normal podcast for you. But I'll try to give you a little bit of it. So Chris, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Jake. I don't have any more details to add, but I'm doing very well.
There we go. That's that box ticked. Okay, let's jump into it. I have a plan to talk you guys over. Now, the plan itself is interesting. I actually think the context of the plan is the most interesting bit. Now, Chris, you don't know this, so this is new information for you, but this plan, it comes from someone who most people will not be aware of because he never actually won Miss America or Miss Universe. But this was Floyd Page. Now, you can look up Floyd Page. He competed in the 40s and 50s, early 50s, and he did have an amazing physique. He did place, I forget what he placed, but he did perform quite well in Miss America competitions, but a very well-developed bodybuilder of that time. And this plan that I'm going to talk through of this is quoted as his favorite routine. Now, this actually came from a magazine published in 1952, is a Weider magazine, Your Physique magazine. And what was interesting in this magazine is they actually, as much as, we can believe it, because obviously Weider did love a little bit of marketing, they actually listed out several bodybuilders who placed in that recent Mr. America competition, and they listed out their routines. And they kind of looked at or briefly outlined some of the similarities. And it's interesting just as a audience member, reader, to actually look at those and compare, well, what are these people doing that's similar? What are they doing that's different? And so they had people like Reg Park and Steve Reeves. And we've actually talked about the Steve Reeves plan on this podcast. And in fact, that's really interesting part as well, because one of the things that Weider was massive on was sets. So Weider was really kind of competing with Bob Hoffman, who Bob Hoffman would kind of say he did the set system, but he kind of did it via different exercises for the same muscle. And wasn't as, like, sometimes he would do multiple sets, but it wasn't like a big feature of his style of training. And so what Weider's doing in this magazine is saying, look, all these people are using sets. They're all big on sets. This thing works. And what's so fascinating about that is we've gone over the Steve Reeves plan, and Steve didn't do sets. In fact, in this magazine, this literal magazine, he didn't do sets. He did a single set, but he just did multiple exercises. And so it's interesting that kind of idea of sets is somewhat synonymous actually with just doing more exercises for the same muscle. So I think that's an interesting piece of like historical context, where it's like sets doesn't always mean multiple sets of the same exercise. In that context, it could actually mean different exercises, same muscle. Anyway, bit of a tangent. So this particular plan, Floyd Page, it was, again, full body. One more quick tangent. All of the plans that they outlined were either full body or, and this is quite interesting, there was one or two that were splits, and one was almost a bro split. But he did it, and we'll probably talk about this at some point, but he actually trained morning and evening on consecutive days. And so he managed to do his bro split over 2 days. And so he's actually still training with a frequency where each muscle was trained to be 72 hours or 48 hours or whatever it was. So it's interesting that even when they were using splits, they realized, hey, actually frequency still matters. But that's a topic for another day. So Floyd Page, full body, 3 times per week, as was the standard. And he suggested starting with 2 sets of 8 to 10 repetitions for each of these exercises. Now, he did say after you're accustomed to it and you've been doing it for a while, you can add a set. And he said, if you want, you can add more sets. But he said, never go above 5 sets. That in and of itself is actually fairly interesting as well, because that's something you do regularly see where people will say, look, start with 2 or 3 sets. If you want to add, you can, but never do more than 5. I've heard many bodybuilders in the silver area say never do more than 5. So there's obviously something that they were finding out there that they thought this was a ceiling for people. So we start with a wide grip bench and we move into an incline dumbbell fly, into a bent arm pullover using a barbell, into dips, so parallel bar dips, into incline dumbbell curls, which were pretty popular exercise at this time, into a seated dumbbell triceps extension, so single arm triceps extension overhead, into a dumbbell concentration curl single arm, a bent over barbell row. Now, we almost have a lat pull down. I thought you'd be happy to see this, but it's not a frontal plane lat pull down. It is a narrow grip, and it's actually like a high to low. So the pulley is starting in the top position and you're pulling it down into the waist height as more like a diagonal lat pull down. And then we've got a single arm dumbbell overhead press, which again was a fairly popular exercise at the time, a barbell behind the neck overhead press, and then toe press on a leg press contraption, and either a squat or a leg press. He said you could choose either one. So we've got, how many exercises is that? I think it's 12 exercises. So that was also a commonality. We saw people usually using 8 to 12, sometimes up to 20 plus like Steve, but that's a very obviously common kind of pattern as well. So Chris, thoughts?
Well, in some ways, it, as you say, fits relatively well with the examples that we've seen previously, 3 times a week. They're using moderate loads, 8 to 10 reps per set, and it's a full body routine. So, fits relatively well with a lot of other examples that we've already seen. Obviously, yes, I'm very happy to see. Sagittal plane, sort of high-low row is kind of the same thing really as a sagittal plane row or a sagittal plane pull down really. They're all kind of doing the same thing as far as the lat's concerned. There's no real differences there. Pair that with your sort of barbell bent over row, and yeah, you do have kind of 2/3 of what you would want for kind of full back development. You're just missing frontal plane there. I know that people are yet again sort of questioning this idea that you need different exercises to train different parts of the lats. Just today we were talking, somebody was making the case that EMG data, they believed, shows that the entire lat is activated in any pulling exercise. Well, that's not the EMG data I'm looking at. I'm looking at EMG data, 2 separate studies that show very profound regional differences in lat activation that track perfectly with the moment arms. So I find it weird when people literally say there isn't data, and I'm like, well, what am I looking at then? Are we living on the same planet? So anyway, we've got some good exercise selection there for back. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's definitely better than some of the others that we've seen. Interestingly, what we have got here is a little bit of doubling up on the overhead pressing. So this is something that goes all the way back to the Sandow type era routine that we started with, or a little bit later than Sandow, but that kind of emphasis on overhead pressing is starting to creep back a little bit here, perhaps just because of personal preferences or targeting muscles that he felt were important to him.
In fact, in this magazine, this exact magazine, I believe it was this one anyway, Steve actually comments on that shift away from Sandow's physique, Steve Reeves, and discusses how at this point, what is perceived as desirable in bodybuilding has now shifted away from Sandow's physique. And he actually names that, which is an interesting progression.
And, there's that tendency that you've pointed out a couple of times, which is to select a number of exercises for the same kind of body area and body part and get that variety. Like we've got the wide grip bench, we've got a dumbbell fly. Now I wouldn't have picked those two to contrast each other. I think they're doing almost the same thing really. And then you've got the bent arm pullover, which is probably a pretty good lower chest exercise. Done a narrow grip bench, then that would be perfect. So that trio of exercises for training the pecs, narrow grip bench would do clavicular really, really well. A lot of people think that it's the incline that makes the clavicular pec kind of targeted by bench pressing. It's not. It's the narrow grip that you want. You want a sagittal plane grip that does much, much more for not isolating because there's no such thing, but for targeting the clavicular pec. You want that sort of narrow grip. But yeah, that trio is getting towards being a really nice trio for
doing the fly in that incline position versus doing the fly flat. What difference are we seeing there?
Honestly, I think you might see a little bit of a shift towards clavicular, but not very much. Honestly, I think that the transverse versus sagittal plane is the thing that really matters. So if people are doing a transverse plane kind of exercise, like a wide grip bench or a wide grip fly, that is really going to primarily, and I say primarily very minimally, it's going to be a little bit more emphasis on the middle pec, the sternal pec, and it's going to do a reasonable job of activating quite a lot of the costal. To target the clavicular much more, you would want a sagittal plane movement really. Yeah, a little bit of an incline is not going to hurt, but the major difference is going to be that plane of motion. And honestly, plane of motion really is one of the biggest factors. That's where we see the differences in the lats, for example, with plane of motion. Obviously, we've got a couple of exercises for triceps. We've got, I think we do have we've got 2 different biceps curl exercises. We've got the variety of lat exercises. As regards the overhead pressing, it doesn't look particularly varied to me unless there was a slight difference in
arm,
form.
often they do that single arm a little bit more sagittal.
Okay. Well, that would be interesting then. So that would give you a bit more anterior delt, probably. And then obviously, standard kind of calf training, again, focusing on the the gastroc there, and then obviously, squat. So again, if I were to look at it and go, what's missing, I would probably say the same thing that I've been saying throughout the entirety of this series of podcasts that we've done, which is I'm not seeing very much hamstrings work, which they could have done with a stiff leg. I'm not seeing that wide grip pull down, which I would expect to see as well. Anything else would be a limitation of the time and the equipment. I'm not obviously seeing a rec fem exercise. I'm not seeing, sort of stuff that would be more suited to that kind of sort of two joint muscle in sort of single joint exercises. But that's an equipment issue.
Yeah, I mean, they were using iron boots to try to do leg extensions. They didn't have machines. Definitely a limitation for sure. It is interesting.
But that really underscores just how similar a lot of these programs were. If we're finding the same issues in many of them, it kind of just underscores how. Yeah,
it does. It does. What I do find interesting, and I'm trying to work out why this is half of them do use a stiff leg deadlift. Half of them do.
So you kind of wonder whether people are dropping them out because of some kind of concern about the exercise, or maybe they just don't like it, or who knows? But it might be that there's another reason for it dropping out.
And one thing that just came to me actually with that is you've probably seen some of the first straps that people were using. I think Hepburn was one of the first people behind using those, and they wouldn't have been common at this time. And I have heard a lot of these bodybuilders talk about training grip so that you could do these other exercises. So maybe that's the limitation, where people were just finding that doing something like a stiff leg deadlift was just too much load to actually hold. And maybe that was a limitation.
Interesting idea. I mean, that would require us really, I think, to eliminate a number of possibilities that I'm not historically capable of, as in I just don't know the history well enough to be able to even comment on it. But, alternating grip is not difficult to use and pretty much eliminates almost all grip issues unless you are literally absurdly strong. And yeah, I mean, there's issues there. I'd be like, I'm not educated enough on the history to know what those factors
what
the
limitations might have been.
Yeah. But I mean, clearly you're right. We do see those stiff leg deadlifts appearing occasionally, but they're not routine. And the question is then, is there a reason why they're getting dropped out? Is it that they were doing them and they just didn't write them in because of some reason, because they didn't want? I don't know. I mean, I would be literally just speculating.
There's so many possibilities, because that's another one you see sometimes. People will be like, here's the plan. And then, of course, they do deadlifts every now and then. It's like, okay, well, why don't you put it in there? Yeah, interesting. And, and then there's also the question of, like, I just mentioned Steve Reeves talked about how the physique, the desirable physique had moved beyond what Sandow had. And what he emphasized is chest. And so maybe there's part of it which is like, well, we just don't really care about hams. And cars were usually undervalued as well. So maybe it was just upper body heavy, and that's what people are looking for. So let's move on. Okay. What are we talking about today?
So we're going to talk a little bit about training frequency. It's a somewhat hot topic at the moment. And we'll probably, we were just chatting about how we might structure this discussion and how it might fit into future podcasts. I think we'll probably end up doing a couple of podcasts on frequency, how they'll get structured. I don't think we've fully figured out. But what we're going to do today is give a little bit of background to what physiologically we think is happening with training frequency, just so that anybody who is new to this topic can at least set it in context of how it works. And then talk a little bit about the long-term training studies, because there has been a trend for a couple of fitness influencers to start making the point that, or start arguing the case, I should say, not making the point, to start arguing the case that the long-term training data say something different from what the physiology would predict. And I just want to kind of reject that and point out that that's not really what the long-term training data say at all. So let me start at the very beginning by just giving a little bit of context and saying what we think we should find when we approach the concept of training frequency. So training frequency in the context of bodybuilding refers to how often you're training a muscle per week. So this is really important just to start out, because if you've come to this discussion from, say, S&C or more sort of the wider parts of the fitness industry, you might think that training frequency means how many times a week you go to the gym. And that's not what we're talking about. So sometimes this can catch people out when they first come into the space and start having conversations. They're like, well, does this mean how many times I'm going to the gym? No. It actually means how many times a week you're training a muscle. So starting from that point of view. So basically, we're thinking about training frequency. And what's going to happen is you're going to train a muscle and it's going to experience a stimulus. And that stimulus is going to take a period of time to be processed. And then after that period of time is finished, the the muscle will then be in an unstimulated state again. So you'll have like what we call a stimulus period. And then when that finishes, you're going to a state of not being stimulated. Now, physiology tells us that muscle fibers are always either growing or shrinking. You can't have a state where the muscle fiber just sits there doing nothing. That doesn't exist. So essentially, the muscle fibers are either growing or shrinking, and they're kind of either what we would say either anabolic or catabolic. And so essentially, over the course of the week, you're going to have periods of time in which the muscles are, or the muscle fibers in the muscle are growing, and then periods of time in which they're shrinking. And so what we can say is that your training program will produce, hopefully, net hypertrophy over the week. So we use the word net to indicate that you've had some hypertrophy in some parts of the week and some atrophy in other parts of the week. Now, perhaps in a later podcast, we can tackle the actual rates of atrophy and talk about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now, but we do know that you do have a period of hypertrophy and a period of atrophy, because if you look at maintenance studies, now there's no such thing as a maintenance stimulus. That doesn't exist because, as I say, fibers are either growing or shrinking. So what you have is a maintenance workout will essentially give you enough hypertrophy to equal out the atrophy later in the week, and you end up with net zero across the week. So hypertrophy equals atrophy, and you end up with maintenance. So you can have, it's got some really nice studies, 6-month long studies showing that, kind of one workout of 3 or 4 sets each week is like giving you a hypertrophy stimulus that then nets to zero at the end of the week because the atrophy equals the hypertrophy.
So just in case anyone's questioning this at this point, if someone's not in the gym, they've never gone to the gym, we're not saying they're going to be atrophying just normally, right? Like technically they will be, but what we're saying is they're maintaining the amount of muscle mass they have because they are still, in fact, getting a stimulus. They're just not getting that stimulus in the gym. They're getting a stimulus from their daily activity, and this stimulus that they're getting from the daily activity is enough to grow the muscle to the point that they currently have. And that is how they are maintaining, in quotes, the amount of muscle mass they currently have. Right?
Exactly, which is why if somebody breaks an arm or a leg and they have the arm or leg put in a cast and it doesn't move, then what happens when you take the cast off, say 5, 6, 7 weeks later or however long it takes, then the limb has shrunk down. Now, you don't need to do anything to get the muscle to grow back to how it was. You just go back into your normal way of life and it magically goes back to how it was because you're loading it in everyday life. And this actually, just a very, very brief physiological interlude, but this actually shows you why hypertrophy is muscle fiber specific. Because ultimately, if you move sort of across the room, you go to collect something, you come back, you fetch a book, you walk into another room, you walk up some stairs, you walk down some stairs. While you're doing those slow movements, the muscle fibers that are being used in those situations are being loaded very, very highly because the force-velocity relationship allows you to produce very high forces in those fibers. So that's your growth stimulus. People go, how can I get a growth stimulus from walking across the room? Well, it's like, well, if you're not understanding that, you don't actually understand anything about hypertrophy because the stimulus of hypertrophy is on a fiber level. And the force-velocity relationship, the slow movement that you're doing, allows the high loading that then causes those fibers to grow. So whatever fibers you use on a daily basis, unless you literally sort of almost teleport across the room every time you move, unless you move at really fast speeds all the time, you're guaranteed to get a slow speed movement somewhere. And as a result, you're going to get hypertrophy happening in the fibers that you're activating. And that's why we end up with this level of muscle mass, which is just like what we have from moving around, and why some people who have a little bit more physically active life, or maybe they do manual labor or whatever they're doing in their life that just has a little bit more level of kind of force producing requirements, they're a little bit more muscular. just because
Or
of
if you were to wear
what
like
they
a
do.
weighted vest.
Or if you were to wear a weighted vest and you were to walk up and down stairs, and you'd find that you started to increase muscle mass as a result of doing that. And people will go, how is that possible? I'm not producing high levels of effort. You said that hypertrophy occurs with high levels of effort. And I'm like, yeah, well, maximum hypertrophy is going to happen with maximum levels of effort because you're hitting as many muscle fibers as you've got access to. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to get hypertrophy at lower levels of effort. It's just you're reducing the number of fibers that you're exposing to that stimulus. So basically then what we've got is this net hypertrophy concept where we've got hypertrophy happening in being processed in the stimulus period, and then you're losing a little bit of muscle mass towards the back end of the week when you're not doing that workout, if that's how your frequency is working. And then of course you end up with the net hypertrophy at the end of the week. So first important concept to understand from a physiological point of view whenever you're thinking about frequency is that you've got these periods of time in which the muscle is growing, and you've got periods of time in which the muscle is not growing, it's actually shrinking very slightly. And if you have a low enough frequency, like once per week, then you can have this situation where you'll get to the end of the week and you're actually netting out such that your 3 sets on Monday, as we've said, or 4 sets on Monday is used up by the end of the week, and you end up with a net zero situation. Now, of course, one of the things that then becomes very contentious is how long is that stimulus period? Now, we have done a podcast on that very concept in, I think it was one of our very first podcasts, and we'll probably have to do another one on it again because it continues to be a contentious concept, but I'm not going to go into that now because I'm just presenting the conceptual basis for understanding training frequency. The next thing you need to be aware of is this idea that hypertrophy is dose responsive to volume. In other words, that's a fancy way of saying that you do more volume, you get more hypertrophy. But the important thing about that dose response is it's non-linear. It actually has diminishing returns. So each extra set you do in a workout has a slightly or quite a lot less impact on the hypertrophy that you get from the workout. So most of the hypertrophy really is coming from the first set, and incrementally a lot less sequential sets. And it probably does plateau somewhere. And again, we can really dive into that data at another time and start talking about exactly where we think that plateau might happen. I would actually probably find that quite interesting because it hasn't been something I've looked at for probably about a year or so. So what we're saying then is the second idea is that the hypertrophy that you get from a workout is dose responsive in a non-linear way. And that now means that you cannot say that you allocate your sets any way you like across the week and get the same amount of hypertrophy. For example, you can't do 3 sets on Monday and say that that equals 1 set on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And just let me reiterate, this has got nothing, this is a separate concept to the hypertrophy atrophy concept. Totally separate. Yeah? So what we're talking about here is a completely separate idea that means that a higher frequency is going to be different from a lower frequency, not just because we've got the atrophy, hypertrophy issues going on, but because we're getting a different amount of stimulus from each set in a workout if it's positioned in a different place. So if I position my set first, I do 3 first sets a week, I'm going to get a totally different magnitude of stimulus from if I do all 3 sets on a Monday.
So what you're saying is unless you were doing a second set in a workout of an exercise, unless that second set produced as much muscle as a first set, then obviously frequency is going to matter. Like spreading that volume across different days is going to matter unless there's exactly the same amount of muscle growth from that second set than the first set. And we have ample data to suggest actually that's not how that works, and there's very clear diminishing returns.
Yeah, so we've got 2 recent meta-analyses. We've got Brad Schoenfeld's meta-analysis from quite a few years ago now, and we've got the recent one by Pelland, and both of those meta-analyses clearly show a non-linear dose response, a nice curve. Now, they have different shaped curves, and, we can, again, when we talk about dose response again in the future, we can dive into that and explain why we think that difference might exist. The point is, though, that both are non-linear, and if you have a non-linear curve, you are saying that your second set is smaller stimulus than your first set, your third is smaller than your second, and so on and so on and so on. Now, again, you can, argue the magnitude of that effect, and that's totally fine. But no matter what the magnitude, doesn't matter the magnitude, if that nonlinear relationship exists, which it does, and actually physiologically you'd predict that it would, because you've got fatigue occurring from set to set, which reduces the level of recruitment, reduces the level of mechanical tension. And you've probably also got what we call a saturation of stimulus. So you get a really big stimulus from the first because you've got nothing going on at the time. And then you try and stimulate a bit more. And it's like, well, how much more can you really stimulate when you've already applied a large stimulus? So you don't get as much stimulus for the second time, simply from a stimulus point of view, and the capacity to produce that stimulus in addition to the fatigue that's happening. So physiologically, this non-linear dose response makes perfect sense, and it's exactly what we would expect. So you've got these two really important concepts. You've got the hypertrophy and atrophy effects going on, and you've got this non-linear dose response. And if you have been following along, you should notice that both of these are telling you that higher frequency is going to beat the socks off lower frequency. You just can't get away from that. The question really only is, what's the upper limit on frequency? Can I train every 5 minutes? I mean, it's like, reduce it to the absurd level. Well, no, obviously we can't, but that conversation is something that requires a lot of digging into the data to understand what it might be. But broadly speaking, if we can get the fatigue out of the way, because we mentioned before, fatigue is a big problem for triggering a stimulus. If we can get the fatigue out of the way, then, we're probably in a good place to be able to stimulate hypertrophy again. So that's really where the limitations come in. Now, again, we can go into what, the role of myops being elevated from a previous workout plays, what role that plays. We can talk about that again in more detail, but just I'm hoping to give people a framework that they can start from physiologically, and we can use that to talk about training frequency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's fairly clear. So if one were budgeting to go on a holiday, you've got two options. You can either look at how much money's coming in. You can work more hours, you can get a second job, or you can look at how much money's going out. You can start eating out less, cutting back on expenses. That's the same way that muscle accrual is working. We can look at how much muscle we're actually building, stimulating the growth of, and then we can look at how much muscle we're losing, atrophying over that period of time. And the net growth is ultimately a combination of those two factors. And you're saying both of those, ultimately the answer to both of those is high frequency. We just need to work out how high that frequency can be.
Yeah. So we've got these two concepts. We've got the atrophy, hypertrophy side of things. How much are we losing by not being in this stimulus period? And we've got this dose response effect, which is telling us that if we position the sets at different times in a week, we'll get a better response than doing them all together. Actually, kind of like, when the social media marketers tell you and they say, look, you need to space your posts out across the week so you get a better response, because every time you do a separate post on a different day, you get a good response. If you try to do all 3 posts a week that you're going to post and you do them all in 5 minutes on a Monday, you're not going to get the same benefit. It's kind of like that's the kind of idea that we're talking about with dose response. It's like the algorithms don't favor you if you post everything at the same time. So we've got these two ideas. We've got that physiology is telling us we should be aware of, and they're pushing us towards this idea that higher frequency is better. Now, obviously, I've kind of created a weekly net stimulus model, which takes these concepts into account, and it allows you to vary them according to what you think the numbers might be. And I give guidelines for what I think they probably are. But you can use that calculator to, sort of figure out what training frequencies are like when you compare them and see which training frequencies are slightly better. And the data that, I've seen when playing with this model based on this physiological concept, these physiological concepts, shows that, sort of broadly speaking, 3 times is better than 2 times, 2 times is better than 1 times a week. Broadly speaking, if you're using the same number of sets for a muscle per week, 3 is going to be better than 2, 2 is going to be better than 1. And that's the concept that I've been arguing with the weekly net stimulus model, with the ideas that we've just walked through as a basis. Now, as I say, we can dive in and talk about those in much more detail later on, but just fundamentally, that's where we're at. So that brings us then to this kind of topic that I wanted to sort of discuss today, which is that some fitness influencers have started arguing back and saying, we don't think your physiologically aligned model is valid because we think that the long-term training studies that have been done on training frequency don't agree with that model. And I'm like, okay, well, let's look at the training studies that we've got and see whether that's true. So depending on when you're listening to this podcast, if you're listening to this podcast shortly after it was first published, then you'll be able to look at my Instagram and see a list of these studies straight away, because it's the last post I posted it earlier today. And what I did was I started with the meta-analysis, or actually it's a network analysis because they used a slightly different type of statistical analysis than I'm accustomed to seeing. And it's called a network analysis. It doesn't really matter. And I started with that list of studies that this research group used for their for their study, because that meta-analysis is the one that people are tending to refer to when they're talking about these frequency studies. Essentially, I went to that meta-analysis, it's called Currier 2023, and I went to that study and I downloaded the list of studies that they incorporated in that meta-analysis, and I went and I looked for all the frequency studies. Now, I'm just going to make a very quick comment on what that meta-analysis did, just so that people understand what's going on. So the meta-analysis had, I think, about 120, 119 separate hypertrophy studies in it. Now, only about 16 of those were actually frequency studies. So you've got 119 hypertrophy studies, which sounds like a really big number. So when people say, oh, look at this meta-analysis, it had 119 hypertrophy studies in, and they found this answer about training frequency. Therefore, we should, accept that as an answer or a source of data. As I say, only 16 were comparisons between different training frequencies. The vast majority, like 87 or so % of the studies incorporated in that network analysis, were actually studies that didn't measure differences in training frequency. Maybe they measured differences in, repetition range or volume or whatever else. Or maybe they just had one training group. I mean, a lot of the studies, when I was going through the list, a lot of them just had one training group and one control. So what I did was I grabbed the 16 studies that just measured the difference in training frequency, and I went through them and I excluded stuff that was DEXA or, kind of not sort of a direct measurement of hypertrophy. I just want MRI, ultrasound, that kind of stuff, CT. And that got me down to 9. And I looked at it and I thought, that's a bit strange, because, was it 9 or was it 8? I can't remember. I looked at it and I thought, that's a bit strange, because I thought there was a Schoenfeld frequency study that compared 1 and 3 times a week, and there is. I mean, and it wasn't on that list, and I don't know why. I mean, I didn't look at the exclusion criteria to figure out why, so it just wasn't there. And I also noticed that there was another one that was missing, which is probably the date, because the Neves paper on frequency was published in 22, and if this study got finally published in 23, there's probably just an overlap in terms of dates. So I don't know why the Schoenfeld got omitted, but I can understand why the Neves got omitted, because the dates didn't probably allow them to have access to that paper at the point when they submitted it to peer review. So that ended up with, as I say, around about 10 or 11 studies, and I kind of just put them in a table, and that gave me comparisons between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and 1 and 3. And I excluded stuff that was comparing like 1 and 5 and, 2 and 5 and stuff, because, really most people want to know the answer between, what do we know about the famous 3 frequencies for training a muscle, which is 1, 2, and 3. And no, there's no data for every other day. We just don't have that kind of data in the literature. So I kind of ended up with only about 10 studies that are direct hypertrophy measurements. Now, that was my process for getting that list. I did not do an exhaustive literature review of the entire PubMed system to see if I'd missed anything. I did double check from my notes in the past, and I couldn't see anything that I'd missed. But if you're listening to this podcast and you've seen the post on Instagram and you've gone, oh, well, why didn't you include X study? Please send it to me. I would love to add it in. That was my process, so that you understand that I went through a process that was largely independent of my own biases. I started from the meta-analysis that I'd been shown the kind of results of, and that was being used to argue that training frequency studies didn't agree with the physiological model. So I started with my opponent's arguments, data source, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I ended up with these studies, and basically what I found was about, I think, sort of more or less 3 or 4 studies for each comparison, 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and 1 and 3. And essentially there was no differences, no significant differences, using the statistical term. There are no significant differences between 1 and 2, or between 2 and 3 for any of the studies included in the kind of group that we've just gathered up. So that kind of, starting point tells you that, maybe frequency doesn't matter, which is actually the view of a big chunk of the hypertrophy research community, who basically say that if you apportion your volume across the week in any way you like, you'll get the same result as long as you're doing the same number of sets to failure. And there are people who still say that. Yeah. There are people who still say that. Physiologically, it's impossible, for the 2 reasons that we started with when we explained the beginnings of this conversation. Like, you can't have a volume dose response that's nonlinear, and you can't have maintenance studies showing net hypertrophy and, net hypertrophy of 0 because you've got hypertrophy and atrophy equaling each other. You can't have those two observations existing and also say that as long as volume is equated, frequency doesn't matter. So clearly there's a problem here, and the likelihood is that we're just not capable of detecting the significance with the current powers that we're using in the current study designs that we're using. So frequency probably does matter, it's just that we're not seeing it. And that brings us to the third category, which is that if you look at compare 1 and 3, every single study shows you either a significant benefit of 3 versus 1 or a non-significant benefit of 3 versus 1. So out of the 3 studies, 2 of them were significantly better with 3 times versus 1 time, and the third was non-significantly better. So that is really, really interesting, because what it tells you is that if you've got 1 and 3 being different from each other, that tells you that the fact that 2 and 1 weren't different from each other and that 2 and 3 weren't different from each other, this is just a statistics issue. This is just a significance problem. It's the fact that, because we get this with some volume studies, like I say to people, if you look at a lot of volume studies, what you'll find is that they may be compared 1 set, 2 sets, and 3 sets, or 1 set, 2 sets, 3 sets, and 5 sets, or something like that. And you get the same issue. You get something like 1 set and 3 sets are different, but 2 sets not different from 3 sets, and 2 sets not different from 1 set. It's like, well, how can that be? And it's just the way stats works. If you don't have a big enough difference, it won't pick it up. And that's what we're probably seeing with frequency. You've got 1 and 3 are clearly different, but 2 isn't different from either 1 or 3. Well, that's just telling you you've got a sliding scale, isn't it? It's just telling you that 2 is worse than 3, probably, and 2 is better than 1, probably. And the only real differences you're picking up because of the statistical capacities are 1 and 3 being different. But this then comes like, what is your process for making decisions about how strength training works? Because, and this is the point I've been arguing, like, if people are taking this kind of maximalist point of view where they go, I only look at long-term training studies. Now, interestingly, this is like an evidence-based idea where you can only use long-term training studies as evidence, and there's parts of that community who think that. And it's like, well, if you're going to do that, then the only thing you can possibly say is that 3 sets is better than 1 set. You can't say anything about 2 sets at all, really. The only thing you can say is that 3 is better than 1. And so really, if you've got a logical brain, you go, well, I'll just do 3 times a week then, because I can't say anything about 2. People go, oh, well, no, you can, because you can say that 2 is you can say that 2 is the same as 3. No, not really, because you can also say that 1 is the same as 2. And that really cancels out the benefits of saying that 2 is the same as 3. So you kind of can clearly see that 3 is better than 2, really. So I think if you have got this set of data and you look at it, you can say that long-term training studies are not inconsistent with the physiological model that we started with, which is that a higher frequency 3 is going to be better than 2, which is going to be better than 1. That's not inconsistent with what these frequency trials are saying. Now, do the frequency trials, long-term training studies, support the physiological model, unequivocally? No, they don't. They're messy, they're vague, they're in their grey zone, but they don't contradict it. And that's the argument that I'm kind of being hit with at the moment, which is that people say long-term training studies contradict what you're saying. Now, why do they say that? They say that because the Currier meta-analysis, which was done on 119 studies, had an effect size for all of their studies that showed that hypertrophy at 2 times was better than hypertrophy at 3 times. But that's not what we're doing here, because we're not looking at those studies, those 119. We're looking at only frequency studies.
So a couple of questions people or critiques or criticisms, or whatever pushback that people might have. So one is you briefly mentioned the difference between direct and indirect measurements. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, so a direct measurement of hypertrophy is one that measures one specific muscle using a scanning or an imaging technique. So if you're using ultrasound, which is very common, the cheapest and easiest and most accessible form of measuring hypertrophy, that's totally fine. If you've got access to MRI or CT or whatever like that, you can use that. Now, if you're using something like DEXA to measure lean body mass, then that's an indirect measurement. And generally speaking, hypertrophy researchers kind of just drop indirect measurement studies when they're doing large-scale meta-analytical review type things, because indirect is messy, it's vague, it's imprecise, it's really not helpful. Again, it's much more of a public health type measurement than what we're interested in, which is this particular muscle growing? So I just excluded the indirect stuff. Now, if somebody wants to do another analysis and show what happens when you put the indirect in, I don't think it will change anything particularly, but I'm just not interested in that data source. I don't think it tells you anything.
And then another point you made is you differentiated between what was statistically significant and what was insignificant statistically, but was trending towards that way. And then obviously we've got another earlier meta-analysis on frequency, the Schoenfeld one. And a critique people would make is 3 times per week was trending towards better, but it wasn't statistically significant. For people who are unaware of that language, can you unpack that?
Yeah, so essentially what statistical tests are trying to do in layman's terms, so if any stats savvy people are listening to this and they don't like my vernacular, they can they can have a go themselves explaining it to lay people. I'm more than willing to listen to that. But basically what a statistical test is trying to do is not tell you how big an effect is, really. It's not trying to tell you that something is massively different in size from something else. It's trying to tell you that the difference that you're observing is not being caused by randomness. It's not being caused by chance. So you're trying to establish a probability, a good probability, that what you're looking at is a genuine difference caused by a genuine effect rather than just by life being random at you. So essentially, historically in sports science, we've followed a very kind of, not rigorous is the wrong word, very rigid almost model of using stats in a certain way. The Bayesian stuff that we talked about today, the network analysis, is totally different from that. It's new. People are starting to use Bayesian probabilities. I don't like the Bayesian stuff because I don't agree with most of the research priors that are used. So Bayesian analysis kind of requires you to start from having a prior, and my priors are completely different from everybody else's unless they follow me, and so we would pretty much start with different starting points. But the statistical analysis that most people use in exercise science, and all of these studies that we've listed out, or I've listed out on my table that we've talked about today, all of those use the same statistical analysis methods, and essentially they're just looking for what we call p-values. So people are kind of going, does my p-value get to less than 0.05 or 0.01 or whatever threshold that they assign significance? And then basically, as I say in layman's terms, getting below that threshold means that your effect is not random or judged to be not random. That's all it is. So essentially, if you have a numerical difference which is large, but it doesn't what we say reach this threshold for statistical significance, then what we're saying is that even though the number is large, it could actually be due to chance. If the number is really large, then you kind of look at it and you go, well, does that mean your study was underpowered to be able to detect that difference? And that's a possibility. And you can kind of do a bit of fiddling around and see from the numbers that the study provides you with whether you think that's the case. But the reason that I mention the numerical difference in this third study is because it's the third of 3 of which the other 2 showed that effect. So if you think about it, if you've got 3 studies and 2 of them show statistically significant benefits of 3 times, and your third has a number trending in the same direction, or the numerically is the same, then that you've kind of got a bit more comfort because you've seen 2 studies that have reached significance. Your third one is trending in the same direction. You're like, well, let's mention that because I've already got the comfort of the other 2 pointing, in the same direction. If the numerical difference had been the other way around, I wouldn't have said anything. Now, people go, oh, I'm going to jump all over that now because Chris is saying that he's biased. No, I'm saying that I'm using Bayesian reasoning because I've actually started and noticed that my priors are being created by the 2 significant results, and therefore my third, I'm expecting it to go in the same direction. When it does, I'm then happy about that. Fine, great. So it's kind of like the only reason I've mentioned that number is because of the other 2 pointing in the same direction. So it gives us kind of a 3 for 3, really. And interestingly, in that third study, which had a numerical difference, the strength differences were huge and much better for 3 than for 1. So not only did it have, and I actually got a bunch of other studies that show that 3 is better than 1 for strength, but that's by the by. So you've kind of got this situation where we can see the strength is supporting the hypertrophy numbers. Of course, perhaps this is a subject for another time, but we can talk about why strength gains are a really good reflection of hypertrophy in most cases. Just came out another study showing that, a really nice paper done in the UK actually, showing that strength and hypertrophy are very closely correlated over time. Strength gains, and hypertrophy are relatively closely correlated over time. So the fact that strength gains were also better in 3 than 1 in that particular study, I think gives me comfort in the numbers probably being meaningful, just not statistically significant. And again, I'm trying to explain this in layman's terms. My vernacular for statistical analysis probably is not correct, but yeah, you can yell at me on social media if you want to do that. So let me just rewind very, very briefly. One of the not rules, but one of the guidelines of meta-analyses is that if your meta-analysis gives you an answer that is not supported by any single study in your meta-analysis, then stop. So if you're doing a meta-analysis of some particular thing and you've got the answer and the meta-analysis tells you that the answer is clearly that X is better than Y, but every single study that you've got doesn't show that X is better than Y, then you need to stop and you need to figure out why that is. So some people have, and that's kind of like just a generally accepted principle of sense checking your meta-analysis. If you do a meta-analysis and you look at your underlying data and none of your data shows that 2 is better than 1, and your meta says that 2 is better than 1, you need to stop and you need to go and try and figure out why your meta is giving you nonsense answers. Now, so essentially you can literally just eyeball your studies and go, what are the studies telling me? And if you've got, like we've got, pretty much a clear pattern of 3 being better than 1 and nothing else happening, then your meta should tell you that 3 is better than 1 and nothing really else is happening. That's what it should tell you, more or less. And if that's not what it's telling you, then you've got a problem with your meta in answering that particular question. Now, again, I'm repeating myself, but I don't think the Currier was really trying to do that. I think that the fitness influencers who are using the Currier and I really hope that nobody in the Currier paper team get this podcast and they think I'm insulting them or upset, being rude about what they've done. I think that fitness influencers are using that paper incorrectly. They are jumping on a numerical value that has been calculated and they're comparing 2 numerical values, 1 for 3 times, 1 for 2 times, and they are claiming that that is meaningful. And I don't think it is. I think that the way the analysis was done doesn't allow you to draw that conclusion because they're including studies that are not really comparable, or at least the frequency elements of them are not comparable.
So where does that leave us? So if someone's asking that question of, well, is 1 time or 2 times or 3 times or every other day, what's best? What should I do if I want to maximize growth? How can one actually look at that question and answer that with any confidence? Because ultimately it sounds like we don't have enough actual outcome data there to rely on.
Exactly, which is why we don't just use outcome data. We use a combination of physiology, outcome data, and actually we can look back at bodybuilders of pre-1950s and see that they train the same way as the physiology would predict. And broadly speaking, the outcome data predict, the long-term training studies. What we've got is a long-term training data set of studies which tells us that 3 is better than 1. And we can infer that maybe that means that 2 sits somewhere in the middle between 1 and 3. That would be logical. The physiology tells us that 3 is better than 2, which is better than 1. So that gives the same pattern. And the bodybuilders of pre-1950 train 3 times a week most of the time. We've got a full house here, I mean, nowhere in this group of points is anybody pointing at 2 saying, oh, look, 2 is clearly better than 3. Well, where? Nowhere. Nowhere.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. Okay.
Nowhere. Zero places. There are 0 places where 2 comes up at the top of the list. It doesn't come up in physiology. It doesn't come up in the bodybuilders pre-1915. It doesn't come up in the outcome long-term training data. Yes, there is a effect size in a meta-analysis of a bunch of studies that didn't compare training frequency that has a higher value for 2 than 3. Honestly, stop sending me that chart. If this podcast achieves anything, please stop sending me the chart of that effect size comparison because it's not answering the question you think it's answering because it's not using data that's designed to answer that question.
Yeah. That's a really important point is that often studies get thrown around online and there might be an image or a chart or a graph or a table or whatever, and that becomes very shareable but people don't realize what it is that is actually based on, or what the question was that analysis was answering, or what the studies that were included were looking at. And it's very easy for something to suddenly become circulated and become gospel when in fact it was never intended to even answer the question we think is being asked.
Exactly. That chart includes data from studies that didn't compare training frequency. People are running around with the idea that because there is a big number of studies incorporated in that chart, it's like 119 studies. Wow. Imagine all that data. It's not allowing you to get at the variance that is ascribed to training frequency. There's too much variance ascribed to other variables like which subjects, trained or untrained, elderly. There's a whole ton of elderly people studies in that meta-analysis, So I was explaining to you before we jumped on this call, I actually typed every single study out into an Excel spreadsheet because I wanted to see it for myself to understand the data perfectly. I actually physically wrote every single study name out on a spreadsheet, and I wrote down whether it was a hypertrophy study, whether it was a strength study, whether they compared frequency or whether they didn't. So I actually did my own legwork and went through every single item on the list. And that's how I know they missed the Schoenfeld out. Now, maybe I just had a blackout moment and missed it off the list, in which case I apologize profusely to them for saying that they missed it out. Maybe it missed their exclusion criteria. Maybe it didn't fit their inclusion criteria, so maybe not an error. But, that's just kind of the process that I went through in making sure that I'd done the necessary work to understand all of the frequency data that was being used to calculate that answer or that chart.
I remember when this study was becoming popular. Obviously, it's 2 years old, but it kind of came to surface largely on social media 6 months ago. And another claim that is being drawn out of that study, out of that analysis, was that single sets were useless. And I remember going in and looking at the studies, all looking at the single sets versus multi-sets, and going into each specific one and realizing this, if we look at direct comparisons,
they'll have the exact same problem.
Yeah.
The exact same problem will exist. So what you'll have is you'll have a bunch of studies that use single sets, a bunch of studies that use multiple sets, and you'll have exactly the same problem. Now, they might say, oh, well, I don't want to make comments about their team because I don't think they're answering questions that we're interested in. I don't. So I don't want to assume that their purpose in the way that they've gone about their analysis is the same as our purposes, because I don't think it is. And therefore, it's inappropriate for me to criticize their analysis because it's done for different purposes. I'm not criticizing what they're doing or have done. This is not a criticism. I'm saying that for our purposes, it doesn't help us with that comparison, because if we want to be very specific about answering the question of multi-sets versus single sets, we would want to actually separate out the studies that have compared those directly and then do a meta-analysis of those studies. And that's the way that you would exclude variance that is not attributable to your question of interest, which is either frequency or volume in this case.
So for our listeners, they've listened to this, they've listened to what you've had to say about this analysis, and then suddenly 10 minutes later, they're going to see a post online and someone's going to say, oh, there's no outcome data that shows that 3 times a week is better. And here's a new study that shows that twice a week is better or as good or whatever. What's your advice to, how do you make sense of this space? How do you make sense when suddenly there's another loud voice who's yelling the opposite and saying, no, there's no outcome data that shows this? What's someone meant to do?
So the only thing you can do is go and look at the source of the information they're quoting, which in this case was in many cases regarding this conversation, was the Currier meta-analysis. So you'd have to go back to that meta-analysis. You'd have to pull up the paper, which is not difficult to do, and you'd have to then look at it and see whether or not what they were saying about the paper was in fact correct. Now, if your expertise doesn't extend to doing that, then you're in trouble, really. And honestly, what are you even doing listening to people giving that information if you haven't got the ability to interrogate it?
Yeah, that is.
And this is an issue that I face all the time when people come to me and say, they send me videos or they send me clips and they say, we've just had a week in which we talked about neuromechanical matching last week on the podcast. We answered a whole bunch of criticisms, and as a result of that podcast, a whole bunch of talking heads started to pump content out about neuromechanical matching, and most of it was negative. And people sent me a lot of that stuff, and they said, this person is saying this, and this person is saying that, and how do I understand it? And I'm like, well, if you think those are criticisms, then you haven't understood the podcast that we did on neuromechanical matching, because almost every single one of those criticisms involved arguing against a non-existent imaginary form of neuromechanical matching that is not what is described in the literature. Neuromechanical matching is about maximizing efficiency. It tries to maximize the torque output for the minimum amount of energy input. It's not trying to find prime movers. It's not trying to maximize joint torque. It's literally just trying to maximize efficiency. And the only way you can do that is by sending as much activation as you can towards muscles that have better leverage. That's it. Very simple. But we've got a whole load of talking heads who are trying to argue against something that doesn't exist, and people are believing it because they haven't done the work to understand what it is in the first place is actually being argued about. But this is human nature. People just want to be entertained. And if that's what your purpose is for going on social media in the fitness industry, you just want to be entertained, then yeah, you are being entertained. You're not being educated because you're not... Because you're not, and people go, no, I want to see both sides of the argument. I'm like, stating that there are two sides of an argument completely ignores the fact that each group of people that you're referring to are not talking about the same thing. You can't, if one group of people is saying, look, this is how neuromechanical matching works, and we think that it is the best explanation for how the brain allocates central motor command and exercise. And the other group of people are saying, here is what we think neuromechanical matching is, which is completely different from what the other group is saying. And we think that it's wrong because this imaginary version that we've created doesn't do what we want it to do. I'm like, well, if you think those are two sides of an argument, you're delusional.
Yeah, it doesn't help you get to the truth, does it? Because it's a straw man argument.
They're not even two sides of the argument. People say, I want to see both sides of the argument. Well, I'm like, well, those two things are not two sides of the same argument. One group is presenting an artificial picture of something that's non-existent, and the other group are trying to explain to you how something works from the literature. If the other group who is criticizing are capable of explaining how the principle is supposed to work and then pointing out errors in it, fine. That's two sides of an argument. But I mentioned this on my Instagram stories. People say, how do you deal with all these people? How do you deal with all these detractors? And I'm like, well, it's not a detractor until they can state my position correctly. They're arguing against a fictitious version of me that doesn't exist, with opinions that don't exist. They've made it all up in their own mind because they haven't done the reading to understand what the actual thing was. Now people go, oh, no, you're just arguing, this is a rhetorical device, you're splitting hairs, it's semantics. No, it's not semantics. It's literally one model is defined as efficiency maximization. The other model is defined as torque maximization. They're totally different models. What they're calling neuromechanical matching is not neuromechanical matching. It's something they've made up as a straw man, maybe inadvertently, because they think that it should work like that, and that's not the way it works. I think we get this problem all the time. And obviously, I don't really have any actionable advice for people to solve that problem because I'm the last person in the world that would be able to help you with that. What you need, if you want to actually find somebody who can give you advice of how to navigate that terrain, you would ask somebody who doesn't already know everything about that subject. I know more about this subject than anybody else on the planet. I mean, that's just a fact of me spending the last kind of 10 to 15 years reading all day. I know this literature.
There are other people who do this for a living.
But I'm doing this out of a obsession, not out of a living. And I think that therefore, and I'm not saying that therefore everyone should listen to me and ignore everyone else. No, I'm saying that I'm not therefore the right person to ask how you should navigate.
In a sense, you failed at that, didn't you? Because you went down this path of having to figure it all out yourself because you weren't satisfied.
Because I wasn't satisfied with the answers I was being given, correct. So I don't know how to solve that problem, and I'm the last person in the world that would be able to answer that for you because, as you point out, I failed at being able to find a reliable source, so I went and established the answers myself. All I can really say that I think is even remotely helpful is find the source that the person is quoting and get that source in your hand. That's all I can say that I think is even remotely useful. If people, because that would have fixed the problem in this particular case, it would fix the problem in the case of neuromechanical matching. If somebody's confused about the frequency debate and they're confused, why do Why does the Currier meta-analysis say this? And why do you say that? Get the Currier analysis in your hand and read it. And if you fully understand it, then you'll come to the conclusion that I've come to. Want to solve the mechanical matching question? Go and download the publicly available review paper on mechanical matching. See what the people who have come up with the hypothesis and built the model have said about it, and you'll understand it's about efficiency. It's about maximizing torque for the amount of energy input. And so you'll straight away see that that's the answer. So all I would say is, if you're trying to navigate this terrain, you have to go back to the source. Now, the nice thing about the way that I've presented all my material is that you can just do that, because you can go to the FAQ, you can find the thing you want to look at, and in the FAQ, every single citation will be there. So you can look at the citation, you can go and put it into Google Scholar, and you can pull up the paper that you're interested in learning about. So I've done it in a way that satisfies that requirement. A lot of other people will just talk about a study and not tell you what it is. And so you'll have to ask them. I'm sure they'll tell you, but you might have to ask them. That's the only thing I can think of.
I do this sometimes when I post online. Sometimes I don't include the citation, and I do that on purpose. And what I do is I'll include keywords that are very obviously used as part of that study. I'll include, say, participant number, maybe the year of the study, some things like that. Because if someone says to me, how do I find the study? And I've included very obvious details, that tells me you don't actually have the skill set to understand that study.
This is a really interesting conversation. I don't want to have this now, but I often do stuff that is kind of similar in the sense that I will exclude information that I think people aren't qualified to assess. So I include a citation. So if somebody wants to pull up the paper, they can go and pull up the paper, and they'll have every single piece of information that's available to them. And if they've passed that threshold of searching for the paper and pulling it up, which is a very low threshold, to be honest, then they can do some assessments. The thing that I never include on any of my infographics is the number of participants in a study. Never, ever, not once. The reason I don't do that is because people who think they know something about research analysis will tell me that they think a study is underpowered or overpowered. Not overpowered ever. It's always a study that they don't like is always underpowered. And they'll just look at the number of subjects and I'll go, how have you deduced that it's underpowered? And they go, oh, I think it should be 20 and it's only 18 or whatever. I'm like, how did you know? And they don't. They don't have the first idea of what a power analysis looks like. And so I never do that. If you've got the ability to pull up the paper, then okay, you can make your own mistakes and you can decide whether you think a study is underpowered or not, and you're probably wrong. You've at least demonstrated the capacity to pull up the paper on your own. What I'm not going to do is give people the ability to do that based on my infographic, because I will spend my entire day commenting saying, have you done a reverse power analysis to establish that what you just said is correct? And they'll be going, what are you talking about? I'm just looking at the number of subjects. I'm going, I can see what you're doing. And it's garbage. So I do similar things in the sense that I don't allow information that I think people are going to misuse. But with the citation, if they wish to, they can go and
access to all that information.
Get access to it, whatever. So I think we're doing the very similar thing in the sense that we're trying to screen people a little bit so that they don't, find information that's just going to distract them from something educational. I mean, at the end of the day, this comes back to, are we trying to educate or are we trying to make money by building an audience? And I think that's unfortunately a question that a lot of fitness influencers probably can't answer very honestly. I'm inadvertently educating because I'm just talking about stuff that I find interesting. And I make infographics because it's the best way of taking notes that I've found. When I come back and look at a study, I want to know what I thought about it when I read it, and the infographic gives me that answer. So really what you're doing when you see my infographics is you're seeing what my note-taking looks like. And everything else is just me organizing my thoughts on subjects. If that's helpful to people, fantastic. But I'm not trying to, really do anything more than find out how these things work.
Fortunately, there wasn't a simple answer there. Ultimately what you're saying is go back to the source, and I think that's good. But unfortunately, going back to that source is likely to take one a day, half a day, just to go through that source material, depending on what it is, and hopefully understand it.
Well, it took me about 5 minutes with the Currier to realize that what we were dealing with was something completely irrelevant to the question. So I think if you
this is true. There might be some
read a research paper, you might be able to disallow certain situations within 5 minutes.
You can broadly see something's being misapplied.
Yeah. I really didn't expect this Currier meta-analysis to be quite such a shoe-in. I thought I'd be traipsing through studies trying to figure out what was going on for like a day and a half. And I knew within 5 minutes of picking up the paper that it was irrelevant.
Yeah.
So it was just an interesting process, really. So I think it really depends. But yeah, what we've got, I think, really is a whole bunch of people who they find themselves attached to a particular person or tribal identity, and then they just kind of go along with whatever's being said. And if somebody publishes a little chart that says, with no citation written on it, with no information about how the data was gathered, and they're like, so 119 studies and it gave this result, and everyone's running around with their hands in the air. It's like, well, okay, well, how did you get 119 frequency studies? How is that even possible? I mean, that should have been okay, so if you want to take a step before the step of getting the source material, if somebody posts a chart that says this chart includes 119 studies and it's a chart telling you about training frequency, hopefully that would set alarm bells ringing, because you should know that there are not 119 frequency studies available. I mean, I hope you know that. Maybe you don't. But yeah, so ultimately there should be some alarm bells ringing, just in terms of does this even pass the sniff test? And then the second thing would then be get the source material.
I mean, hopefully educators would know that. The problem is people who just want to know what they should be doing. And I know I say hopefully because most won't, but there's people who just want to know what they should be doing in the gym. They don't want to
they shouldn't be following me then. I mean, honestly, come on. I mean, they can follow you. I mean, that's what your account is designed to do. It's designed to help people understand exactly how they can either obtain a program that will give them the best results bodybuilding, or they can even write their own based on the education that you provide. And they have the confidence that it is based on pre-1950 bodybuilders who were doing things pretty much without the aid of any extraneous, pharmaceuticals. And so it was pretty much the best anecdotal data that exists and has ever existed. So, I think that's what your account is brilliant at. But if somebody's coming to my account and complaining that I'm not giving them a, education in how to write a program, then sorry, I'm not intending to do that. I'm for the tiny fraction of percentage of people on the industry who want to understand how this works, not just what works, but how it works, because that's my obsession, is figuring out how it works. The few things that irritates me is when somebody comes to my account and tells me what they think I should do to help them. It's like, no, I'm sharing what I think is interesting. If it doesn't help you, go and follow somebody else.
Yeah, can you do content like this?
No, I can't. I'm doing content because I find it interesting. 160,000 people also find it interesting, which is fantastic. But I'm not going to change what I do to appeal to noise, because I'm not really that commercial. I'm just doing stuff that interests me. I mean, hopefully people should realize that by now. If I was trying to do stuff that attracted attention, I would not do random technical infographics on the stretch shortening cycle. I would not do stuff on, kind of like, how does, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something random that I've done recently that was completely irrelevant to 99.9% of the planet. There's infographics that I post that people are looking at going, why would you post that? And I'm like, because I find it interesting, because it helps me understand how this physiology works. So I looked at the study and I did notes on it.
I have one more question for you before we wrap up. And I know, again, we've gone down a bit of a tangent here, but it is somewhat relevant. So if we don't have as much sort of, outcome data perhaps as people might, lead others to believe that we do, one option we have is to look at things like physiological models. And so you've developed a weakly net stimulus model. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail, perhaps in future episodes. But in a nutshell, what is a model? Why does a physiological model actually help us answer these questions that we're lacking enough outcome data on?
So basically, a physiological model is a very useful tool for two reasons. Firstly, it starts by establishing some really strong physiological observations which we're confident. So we're very confident, for example, in the two physiological observations that we started with today, which is that there is hypertrophy is always muscle fibers are always either growing or shrinking, and therefore we've got the possibility of net hypertrophy over the week being zero, because you have hypertrophy followed by atrophy. Secondly, we're very confident that the stimulus that you can create in a strength training workout is non-linear, that you don't stack sets on top. Again, physiological reasons for that. If you then build a model on the basis of those really strong observations, you can tinker with some of the numbers, but ultimately the shape of the model is always going to be broadly the same. Now, if you've got a whole lot of outcome data that don't fit that, or they're very, what I would call grey data in the sense that they just don't tell you anything, then your model can add to your outcome data, your long-term training data, and give you like a steer on what you think is happening. Now, that's exactly what we've seen today, which is that the physiological model tells you that 3 is better than 2 and 2 is better than 1, definitively. The very grey, messy kind of outcome data tell you that 3 is better than 1, but 2 we're not really sure about. So straight away, you just put the two together and you go, oh, okay, I can see what's going on. No worries. So it allows you that extra kind of steer on your training studies data to be able to put the two together and form a very clear picture of what's going on. Secondly, if you have a model, especially one that has had a calculator built on it, or you can run in Excel, you can fill in the gaps that you don't have. So somebody says to me, what happens if I train every other day? And the outcome data maximalists will say, oh, well, we don't know. It could be anything, It could be anything. You could be teleported to Mars. I mean, we just don't know. And yet the model will tell you exactly what happens. So it fills in the gaps. It fills in the gaps in the data that you don't have. Essentially, it's good for those two reasons. It allows you a bit more confidence on your training study data and fleshes the picture out a little bit. And then secondly, it allows you to answer questions that you just can't answer from the long-term training data. And of course, practically, from a personal point of view, it allows you to literally put your training program into the calculator and tell you whether you could manipulate it in one direction or another and get a better result. So from a practical point of view, it's actually very interesting as well. It actually is usable in a kind of programming sense, but, not giving the game away too much, but it will pretty much tell you just to train like a pre-1950s bodybuilder. I mean, that's all it's going to tell you. So, I kind of like take great comfort in the fact that, yes, the outcome data is a little bit grey. It doesn't tell you everything you want to know. The model sits really well with the outcome data, tells you a lot more. And the bodybuilding community pre-1950 basically tells you to train how the model tells you to train. So for me, I don't see how anybody can argue with this with a straight face. I think that anybody who wants to argue with this has got to say, why does the outcome long-term training data not show that 2 is better than 3 if you think 2 is better than 3? It doesn't show that. Why do pre-1950 bodybuilders not train with 2 times a week or upper lower splits? They just didn't. And why does the model not give you 2 times a week better than 3? It doesn't. So, there is no part of this matrix that supports 2 times a week. It just doesn't exist. Everything supports 3. Now, some support 3 better than others, but they all kind of lean in that direction, some strongly, some weakly. And I think ultimately it's just being pushed. The idea that 2 is somehow the same as 3 or better than 3, it's just being pushed by people who like to train like that. That's all it is. People decide they like training like that, and therefore, because their ego requires their preferences to be perfect, they can't really, kind of get themselves out of the mindset that their preference might not be perfect.
Yeah. I mean, you can't overlook, I guess, human psychology in all of this, and in these topics and questions that come up on social media. Obviously, full body, at least in the world that I was part of, full body was not the norm. That was okay for beginners, but that was it. No bodybuilder would do that. No advanced lifter would do that. And so the status quo was either growth split or upper lower. And anytime we challenge that status quo, there's people who stand to lose something from that. And there's going to be, emotional attachment to that and kickback to that.
Of course.
And I guess ultimately that's kind of what we're seeing, and it'll be interesting to see what we see over the next couple of weeks. I'm sure there'll be a lot of emotional, responses to what we're saying. But, the question is ultimately, like, why are you doing what you're doing? If someone has a good justification why they want to stick to upper lower, by all means, let's hear it.
Well, nobody has to justify to me how they train. They can train however they like. I mean, I've got no judgment on anything whatsoever. The only thing that I'm interested in is, what physiologically is happening. And in the absence of any human factors, what would be the best training program? Leaving aside whether somebody likes it or dislikes it, what would be the best training program? I mean, I think that's a massive red herring when people say, you can't argue that 2 is better than 3 or 3 is better than 2 because somebody might like 2 and somebody might like 3. And I'm like, no, that's just simply not the question. It's literally a relevant question. We want to answer this question first, physiologically, what is the best possible outcome? And then separately, after that, you can make a decision about what you want to do.
Exactly. It's a coaching question.
It's
Exactly.
absolutely a coaching question, you know.
Okay, we went down some pathways I didn't expect us to go down, but hopefully there's something there for people who followed us how far do we go? An hour and a half. Hopefully you guys have kept up. I think this is a really interesting topic. I do think that this is one that, you know, obviously it's
frequency in
really,
general. Or
yeah.
others. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, full body, upper, lower, splits, frequency, all of this stuff. It has a huge amount of application. It's really interesting physiologically. It's where all of this sort of converges. So I'm sure we'll do future podcasts on some variants of this topic. But, you know, as always, we're interested in what you guys are interested in as well. So if you've got questions, feedback, ideas based off of this or just on other topics as well, please let us know.
Send them to me because Jake doesn't read his direct messages.
You can put them in my Q&A. That's fine as well. I see that. I just get overwhelmed with DMs. There's too many. So put in my questions. I'm amazed that you check your DMs. That feels like inverted to what I'd expect. But
Sure.
Okay. Anyway, thank you guys for joining us, and we do hope you'll join us again next week.